Hi everyone, this is Bree Science Lab. Welcome back. We're going to go over the brain today. I'm going to go ahead and dive in because we know how lengthy anatomy videos can get. This is usually going to be one of the first videos that you guys should watch if you're taking this course at a university. Usually universities will follow a setup similar to terminology first, and then the skull and brain, followed by like face muscles and maybe cranial nerves. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with that as well. Before we start though, you should know that the brain is part of the central nervous system. If you've taken any biology courses before or any science courses, you probably know that the central nervous system is one of two nervous systems. We have our CNS, so central nervous system, and our PNS, our peripheral nervous system. Now, our central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And if these don't sound super important to you, they are super important. And they are so important that we actually protect them using layers called meninges. Now, meninges have 3 layers and they cover the entire brain and the spinal cord. These 3 layers are going to introduce some of the terminology we went over in the first video, deep and superficial. Now, when we say deep and superficial in anatomy, deep is going to be the layer closest, more next to, I guess, the brain. And more superficial will be the part that's not as close, that's not touching the brain exactly. All right, so these 3 layers going from more superficial to deep are going to be the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So that pia mater is going to be touching that brain almost exactly, right? It's going to be right on there. Once you memorize these maters, you should know there's also a very important space called the subarachnoid mater. Now the subarachnoid mater, if we go ahead and we break down that word, sub means below the arachnoid mater, right? So subarachnoid, below the arachnoid mater. Subarachnoid space means there's a little space under that layer, right? So this can be between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, if it's beneath the arachnoid mater, right? And this space contains CSF. CSF is a very important thing in the body. This is known as cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. This is a very important fluid that flows through the subarachnoid space and also through the ventricles, which I will teach you more about once we get inside the brain. And it's very protective and it's very useful. We don't focus much on it in anatomy. We just want to know how it flows and where it's flowing, all right? But just be aware of that in case you're asked. You want to know in anatomy both the acronyms as well as the full name. So CSF or cerebral spinal fluid. That being said, we're going to start how we start most of my videos. We're going to go ahead and orientate ourselves. So if you guys notice, this is the brain, all right? This is a lateral view here, all right? The lateral view. This is a superior view, so from above. This is another lateral view, a posterior view. So this is the back of the brain. This would be closer to your spine. This is your anterior part of your brain. This is going to be closer to your forehead, if that helps. And then that being said, this is going to be that inferior portion. All right, that's the easiest to figure out because you have your cerebellum, which is a Latin, I believe, for little brain. All right, and you can also see those cranial nerves and part of that brain stem, which is all going to be shown on the inferior portion. All right, now we're going to start with the superior portion of the brain. And we're going to go over the lobes. Now, the lobes of the brain, they have names and they're going to sound fairly similar or familiar. They should at least if you started with the skull video because they are corresponding to the parts of the skull. So, this right here, all right, that is your frontal lobe, This is your parietal lobe, this side as well, all right? Your occipital lobe here in the back, if you remember you had that occipital bone, occipital lobe. On the sides, you can see your temporal lobes. These are only visible from a lateral view, all right? So temporal lobes. Now, you can tell that there's also this really, really big line that kind of separates the left and right hemispheres, right? The left and right hemispheres. This is known as your sagittal, or my bad, this is known as your longitudinal fissure. Your longitudinal fissure. So longitudinal kind of meaning going this way, up and down. That's going to separate the left and right hemispheres. You have one other fissure in your brain, and a fissure is a deep groove, if you remember from our first video. So there's one other deep groove, and that's gonna be on the side, all right? This is your transverse fissure. This is your transverse fissure. Now, this transverse fissure is separating the cerebrum, which is that brain matter, from the cerebellum, this little brown walnut-looking structure, all right? That being said, we're gonna go back to that superior view, and we're gonna go over what all these little bumps are. Now, do not worry. You do not have to name each of these little bumps and lines and everything. You will have to name a few though. All right, starting with the central sulcus. If you remember, sulcus is a groove, but a fissure is a deep groove. So that was your longitudinal fissure, but a sulcus is going to be one of these lines, all right? This line specifically is the central sulcus. It's the most important sulcus you have in your brain. Plural for sulcus, all of these would be sulci, all right? So all of these are plural. The central sulcus is a very important landmark because you can see it from almost any view of the brain. So if I open it, you can still see it right here, all right? That's the central sulcus. You can see it from the side if I put this back together. All right, the central sulcus, it goes all the way down. And if you notice, all right, if you notice, it's the only one that's continuous across that longitudinal fissure. So it's pretty straight. It's gonna be really easy to pinpoint. Now, these bumpy portions that kind of look like noodles, all right, not the lines, but the bumpy portions, those are known as gyri, plural, or gyrus, singular, okay? Now, there are a couple important gyri you want to know, and they are in regards to that central sulcus, all right? So first is going to be the post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus. So if we break that down, post meaning behind, central, so behind the central sulcus, gyrus, the gyrus behind the central sulcus. So post-central gyrus. This is the central sulcus, so the gyrus behind that would be this one right here. So this is the post-central gyrus, all right? It's the gyrus behind that because this is the posterior side over here. Any guesses as to the pre-central gyrus? The pre-central gyrus, if you guessed this gyrus right here, you would be correct. Congratulations. Pre as in before or in front of, all right? With the same breakdown as the post-central gyrus. That being said, that is one of, yep, that's all of them that you have to know on the top. I just want to double check. We're gonna go back to that lateral view, the lateral view, and we're gonna go over one more sulcus, all right? One more sulcus. We're gonna go over this one right here. This is the lateral sulcus, the lateral sulcus. It's also a very important one. It's separating that parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So that was that lateral sulcus. Now, if you wanted to pinpoint the post or pre-central gyrus, here it is. This is the pre-central gyrus on the lateral view and the post-central gyrus, as well as the central sulcus. All right. Great. So that is pretty much everything we can go over on the cerebellum. But we can also cut the brain and ask about the inside. And that is where we are going to now. So if you noticed, I took this into left and right hemispheres. That means you're looking at a mid-sagittal view, all right? So we cut this mid-sagittally, meaning right down the middle, left and right, okay? And we are going to first locate that central sulcus. So like I said, you can find the central sulcus from any view. This is that central sulcus right here. And if we follow the line, we know that this right here is the central sulcus just from an inside view. The area surrounding that central sulcus, all right, this area right here, it's almost like a square, all right, that area is known as the paracentral lobule. The paracentral lobule. So if we go ahead and break that down, it makes a lot of sense. Para, meaning around or surrounding. Central, all right, that central sulcus, so surrounding the central sulcus. Lobule, just referring to this little area right here. All right, so paracentral lobule. Now, if we move posteriorly, we come to something called the precuneus. The precuneus, and I love the precuneus. It is my favorite area of the brain. And why, you might ask? Because I think it looks pretty cute. You may not think so if you are looking at it from this view. However, if I flip this over, you will notice if I trace this, that this is a little elephant. If you guys see that? All right, so here's his little legs, all right? Here's the trunk, the little eyes. It looks like an elephant, okay? Oh, let me move it down a bit. There's the elephant. And I sure hope that looks like an elephant to you too, because elephants are pretty cute. So that's gonna be known as our precuneus. Just remember, it may not look like an elephant if you are looking at it right side up, right? So I am now gonna move even further back, all right? Even further back, we're gonna have our parieto-occipital sulcus. Our parieto-occipital sulcus, what is that, you may ask? It is this sulcus right here separating the precuneus, or the elephant, from this area right here. This is not cute. This does not look like an elephant. So this is just the cuneus, because it is not cute, all right? This is the cuneus. So that parieto-occipital sulcus is separating that precuneus from the cuneus. We have one more sulcus you're going to want to know from this view, and it's this one right here. This is your calcarine sulcus. Your calcarine sulcus, and your calcarine sulcus separates that cuneus from the lingual gyrus. Lingual gyrus, which is right here, okay? And if you remember, what was this? This was one of those very important fissures. This is your, I hope you said, transverse fissure, all right? If it helps, I will move it back here so you guys can see. There's that transverse fissure I pointed out from the outside. That inside view is going to be the same, that transverse fissure. Great. We have one more gyrus that you want to be familiar with, and that is this. This is your cingulate gyrus, and that's with a C, all right? C as in cat, cingulate gyrus. And this line above it, what were those little lines called? Those were called sulci, plural, or sulcus, singular. This is that cingulate sulcus. Cingulate, also with a C, sulcus. So, true or false? This is the cingulate sulcus. I sure hope you said false. This would be known as the cingulate gyrus. So those bumpy portions are the gyri, and this line would be the cingulate sulcus, all right? Now, we're gonna get more into that inner brain stuff. This will mostly be a focus in your psychology classes and your brain classes specifically, but you also are gonna probably have to know it for your anatomy classes. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna move it up a little bit so you guys can see that a little better, all right? Because some of these get a little small. While you don't usually have to know functions in your anatomy classes for a lot of these, you will probably want to learn some of them for this because it makes it a little bit easier to learn. Starting with the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, right? This portion right here, that is one of the main ways your left and right hemispheres communicate with each other, all right? And remember, when you are looking at a cut like this, it will be the same on the other side. So if you have one thing on this side, you're gonna have two in total on your brain. If you have two, you're gonna, on this just one view, you're gonna have 4 in total, right? If you see just half of something, that means you have 1 in total. This is one of those. This is just a way of communication between the 2 hemispheres. Now, I just want to make sure you guys can see that. We're going to get into the septum pellucidum, all right? This is your septum pellucidum. It is a layer, fleshy layer wall, basically, that separates the 2 lateral ventricles, all right? the two lateral ventricles. So we're gonna first have to break all of that down, right? Septum, it refers to a wall of tissue, kind of, that's like a fleshy tissue. So think of your nose. Your two nostrils are separated by that septum. So if you ever get a septum piercing, or you know someone that has a septum piercing, it's a piercing that goes through the wall that's separating your two nostrils, right? So that's a fun way to remember it, especially if you're big into piercings. But I also mentioned that this separates the two lateral ventricles. You have 4 ventricles in total. You have 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle. Now, these ventricles contain CSF. CSF, if you remember from the beginning of the video, is known as cerebrospinal fluid. It's that super, very life-important fluid, all right, that came from this structure right here, as well as some other structures, but this is one of them, and also flowed in that subarachnoid space, all right? That subarachnoid space. That separates your 2 lateral ventricles, all right? So those 2 lateral ventricles contain that CSF. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna move backwards a little bit to your fornix. This is your fornix right here, all right? Your fornix. Down here, you're gonna have your anterior commissure, your anterior commissure. If you have an anterior commissure, chances are you're gonna have a posterior one too. And if you guessed that, you would be correct. Right here is your posterior commissure, what is labeled 13. So anterior commissure, posterior commissure. You also have this guy right here. This is your choroid plexus. I pointed it out just a few seconds ago. It secretes CSF. Usually, if you see that pink fleshy stuff with a whole bunch of dots on your model, that is going to try to say, you know, that it secretes CSF. So you'll see this also on a ventricle model if you have one, and it will look pretty similar to this. Now, we're also going to point out this little guy too. This is your habenula. Your habenula, it's super small. It's right below that choroid plexus, all right? That's your habenula. Your habenula is really important in your reward pathway. And so how I like to remember this is if you do a really good job, all right, you get a habenula pepper as a reward, all right? So congratulations, you won a habenula pepper if you did really good, right? So habenula reward system, you win that reward. Then you're gonna have your pineal body, all right? That's this little guy right next to those. That's your pineal body. It's super important in what? I hope you said your circadian rhythm. So that's like melatonin, it secretes melatonin, your pineal body. It's important in your sleep-wake cycle. You also, right below those, have your superior colliculus, which is this bump right here, and your inferior colliculus. So you have 2 on this side, a superior and an inferior colliculus. You actually have 4 all in total, all right? 4 in total. And when you are referring to all 4 together, it is referred to as the corpora quadrigemina, all right? Which is a very big mouthful. So I try not to refer to all 4 at once, but this is 1, this is 2, and then you have 2 on the other hemisphere as well. Superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Now we're gonna move back to this little area right here. All right, this is your interthalamic adhesion. All right, interthalamic adhesion, or your intermediate mass. So I'm gonna kind of bring this up so you can see it a little better. It's that little brown dot right there. That's gonna be referred to as either name, your intermediate mass or your interthalamic adhesion. Then you're gonna have the area around it. So surrounding it, all right, is known as your thalamus. Your thalamus, all right? If we go below that, you're gonna have your subthalamus, right? So right below the thalamus is your subthalamus. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of a raised portion. It's like a little slope. That's your subthalamus. And down here is gonna sound really familiar also. This is your hypothalamus. Hypo also meaning below, but hypo is like even more below than sub, okay? So this is your hypothalamus. Very important if you learn about hormones or anything like that. That's your hypothalamus. And then you're gonna have your mammillary body. Your mammillary body, which is this little guy right here, you actually have two of them. Now, it is said that it was named the mammillary body because, you will never guess, the person who discovered it, I don't actually know their name, I wish I did, but the person that discovered it thought they looked like breasts, so he named them mammillary bodies. Very clever, all right? So that's something different, but hopefully you won't forget those now, all right? Now, we also are gonna have this little guy known as your optic chiasm, all right? Your optic chiasm, and that's this area right here, all right? Kind of close to the mammillary body, this area right here. And you're also going to have something that sticks off like this, okay? It's not on this model, it broke off, all right? And some models just won't have it, but it's this little gland, all right, that hangs off of this area right here. And it has this little swoop, all right, kind of like a swing, all right? And that swing is known as the infundibulum because swings are so fun. So think swing, infundibulum. And if you saw a better picture, you would know it looks like a swing or a slide, whatever you prefer. It can also be referred to as the pituitary stalk, which makes sense because at the end, right, you see the handle of my pen, at the end you're gonna have that pituitary gland. So the pituitary stalk, which would be this area right here, leads to that pituitary gland where my fingers are, right? Yay, all right, so we're almost done, but we're not quite there yet, guys, all right? We're gonna go back to this thalamus area. And this thalamus is also going to sometimes be referred to as the third ventricle. So like I said, you have two lateral ventricles, which your septum pellucidum separated. If we move further back, this area right here would be your third ventricle. You only have one. And then last, but certainly not least, you're gonna have that fourth ventricle. I'm gonna come zoom in. Your fourth ventricle is right here. So, what about this little area that leads from your third ventricle to your fourth ventricle? All right, I don't think, unless you have any background, that you would be able to guess this, so I'm not gonna ask you to. This is gonna be known as the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. The cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, that is a mouthful, so you might have to go over that one a few times. But that leads from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. It carries that CSF. It's like a little pathway, all right? Now, we are gonna go over this little guy right here. Because we separated the brain into left and right hemispheres, this cut also separated the cerebellum into left and right, okay? And now you can see this little white stuff, all right, all over the inside of the cerebellum. This is actually known as arbor vitae, which means tree of life, all right? If you took Latin at all, tree of life, and you can kind of see that. That looks like this, not the stem, but the trunk. These look like the big branches and everything. So arbor vitae, all right, tree of life. So then we're gonna go over this area right here. So, like I said, your CNS, or your central nervous system, is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. And in addition to that, it was also going to include your brainstem, right? So your brainstem is what leads your brain into your spinal cord, basically, your brainstem. And you can notice, kind of, this is your brainstem right here. You can see how that happens. See, it gets thicker and thicker from that midbrain area, and it gets thinner and thinner. That's because this leads into your spinal cord, which is going to be very, very thin because it actually goes through your spine, made up of your vertebrae. It's going to go right through the center of those. And because everything in anatomy likes to have its own name, the brainstem is going to have different parts of it, all right? Starting with the midbrain, which is this part of the brainstem right here, all right? I can move it up a little bit. This is the brainstem right here, all right? Or the midbrain part of the brainstem. And the midbrain, how I remember that is it's quite literally in the middle of the brain, right? So this is the front portion, this middle portion, this is kind of halfway, and it's right up there in the middle of the brain. If we move down, all right, we're gonna get to the pons. The pons includes both this little bubble area as well as this area over here. This is the next part, right inferior to the midbrain is your pons. And below that, you're gonna have your medulla. Your medulla is down here. It's that last part of the brain stem. You might hear it referred to as the medulla oblongata. All right, if you take a lot of hormone classes or psychology classes, that's your medulla oblongata. Pretty important in breathing. Now, I do believe that is it for the inside, all right? So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna close this up, all right? We're gonna close this up. All right, now we're gonna move on to this inferior view here. You're gonna recognize a few things that we've already gone over before, all right? So up here we have that frontal lobe. If you guys remember your frontal lobe, this was that temporal lobe right here. This is that longitudinal fissure. All right, this is actually, I'll raise it up for you guys, this is actually your pons and your medulla oblongata, or just your medulla, whichever you prefer, I suppose. This is actually going to be your cerebellum. I don't have a cerebellum model with me that doesn't include the brain, so you can only see a few things on this cerebellum, but for future reference, this is going to be your anterior lobe of the cerebellum, your flocculonodular lobe. And I had a lot of friends that used to say, you know, like, oh, Waka Flocka Flame, the rapper and everything. And that's how they remembered the flocculonodular lobe. And then this is your posterior lobe of your cerebellum back here. And that's pretty much everything you've already learned. Oh, I guess except for these mammillary bodies right here, you can see them both together now. It's those little guys right there. And you also have the optic chiasm, which is right here, your optic chiasm. We also pointed that out when we were going over it, the inside. But other than that, we can see our cranial nerves. Now, you have 24 cranial nerves in total, 24, because you have 12 on either side. That's usually a trick question, all right? So be prepared for that. You have 12 cranial nerves on both sides. So while you're learning these, you're just gonna learn numbers 1 through 12, but just remember 1 through 12 is repeated also on the other side, so you have 24 in total. When it comes to the cranial nerves, you're going to want to know the number. You're going to want to know the Roman numeral, all right? And then you're also going to want to know the name and whether it's sensory, motor, or both, all right? So sensory or motor means what type of nerve it is, and some actually have both innervation. If you don't know your Roman numerals, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial here on my iPad. All right, so ignore my screen's a little dirty, but I'll give you a quick reminder. So 1 would be an I, right? That's basically 1. 2 would be 2 I's put together, all right? 3 is 3 I's put together. Forgive my handwriting. 4 is 1 I, 1 V. So how I think of it is V is 5. And if you have an I in front of that, that means 1 minus, all right? So V minus 1 would be 4, which is, you know, like that. But if you're adding, all right, this would be 6. So if you put it afterwards, that's 6. And then 7 would be 2 I's after the V. 8 would be 3 I's. 9 would be X minus 1, all right, because X is 10, all right? And that's just a quick little rundown for you. But we're gonna go back to the cranial nerves now. So just know your Roman numerals for me, please, as well as all of those other things we just went over. So we're gonna go over the numbers and the names really quick, and I'll also mention whether it's motor or sensory at the end, okay? So we're gonna start off with number 1, okay? You can see on this side they're actually labeled, so we're gonna go ahead and start with that side. This is cranial nerve number 1. All right, cranial nerve number 1. This is your olfactory nerve, your olfactory nerve. This is cranial nerve number 2, your optic nerve. This is cranial nerve number 3. It's kind of hidden down here. I'm gonna do my best to show you. Cranial nerve number 3, and that's your ocular nerve, your ocular nerve. Then you have cranial nerve number 4, which is going to be hidden over here on the side. Cranial nerve number 4, that's your trochlear nerve. Then you have cranial nerve number 5, all right, also kind of hidden over here. You can see that little V, by the way, with the lines. That's your trigeminal nerve. It also has 3 branches that you want to know: your ophthalmic, your maxillary, and your mandibular. These are going to come in handy when you go over your face muscles, because you want to know the innervations of your face muscles, and your trigeminal nerve is one of those. And then you have to know which branch it is, all right? Then we have our vestibular, or actually, that's number 8. We're going to go to our abducens nerve. Our abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve number 6, and it's actually not the next nerve on here. So far we've been following this line down, but cranial nerve number 6 is actually this one right here. All right, this is your abducens nerve. All right. Cranial nerve number 7 is, we're going to go back. This is cranial nerve number 7 right here. It's close to another one. So 7 and 8. 7 is your facial nerve, all right? Your facial nerve. And then right behind it, the one right next to it, is cranial nerve number 8. And cranial nerve number 8 is your vestibular cochlear nerve. Your vestibular cochlear nerve. So if you'd rather learn them going down, that would come right after number 5, all right? And then, all right, we're going to get to number 9. Number 9 is kind of a mouthful. It's your glossopharyngeal nerve. Your glossopharyngeal nerve. And number 9 is going to be, oops, let me pick my pen back up. Number 9 is going to be this one right here, if I can get it pinned, right here, and I'll kind of zoom in. It's a little hard to see. That's number 9 right there. Then we're going to go to number 10. It's right next to number 9. This is number 10 right here. This is your vagus nerve. And your vagus nerve is super, super exciting. It's a big subject in research right now because it's super, super important. And they're finding more and more stuff related to the vagus nerve. So if you're interested in research, the vagus nerve is a very important one that I would recommend looking into. All right. Then you have 11. 11 is your accessory nerve. This is your accessory nerve right here, your accessory nerve. All right, it's really fun, and I like to think that like, oh, the brain is accessorizing, how cute, right? Because it has all these bumps. It like makes the brain look like so much more fun, right? So this is all 11. You can kind of see the Roman numeral there with an X and a 1. And then you have your last one on this side, and that would be your cranial nerve number 12. So you're actually going to go bounce back in here, and it's going to go up. So even though that's 11, this is 12. All right, this is cranial nerve number 12, and cranial nerve number 12 is your hypoglossal nerve. Your hypoglossal nerve. And your hypoglossal nerve is the last nerve, but you have 2 things on either side of that hypoglossal nerve. You have your olive, all right? Your olive is to the lateral side. So number 38 right here is your olive. 39 is known as your pyramids. And then down here, number 37 is actually known as the desiccation, all right, desiccation of pyramids. And desiccation means to cross the midline, so that's where they cross, all right, the pyramids. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put this. Now, I wanted to go over how you know if something is motor, sensory, or both. Now, I would simply go by whether it matches up to this mnemonic or not. So the mnemonic is, some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. So some say 1 and 2, all right, some say both are sensory, all right. Money matters would be 3 and 4. Those are only motor, all right. 3 and 4 are only motor. But, so 5, cranial nerve number 5 is both motor and sensory. Cranial nerve number 6 is just motor because it's my, all right? Brother number 7 is both sensory and motor. Says for number 8, just sensory. Cranial nerve number 9 is big. That means it's both sensory and motor. Big brains, so 10 is also both. Brains, B, for both sensory and motor. Matter more, M and M, for 11 and 12. 11 and 12 are just motor nerves. I hope you guys enjoyed that. There's also a mnemonic to memorize the names of the cranial nerves, if that helps. There's tons online that you can look up. This is one of the more popular ones, and it's Only one of the two athletes felt very good, victorious, and healthy. So, and those correspond to the first letters in the names of the cranial nerves. So, for example, only, O for olfactory, one for O for optic, O for oculomotor, T for trochlear, T for trigeminal, and continued. Thank you for joining me here on Bree's Science Lab, and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you.